And this is a shot that was animated by another animator. This is a shot by Octavius. He's a student at Animation Mentor and he's doing some really great work. And in this shot, we have this character who steps forward, pointing gun at the screen, and in this case, we want to try and polish the gun. Let's say we want to clean up the arcs, make it just look really nice and clean. Not a problem, we'd animate the gun, okay, great. Except in this setup, this gun is being controlled by multiple things. In order to make it easier to animate, this gun has been constrained to the body. This is so that if the character is holding their arm straight out, as they move the body, the hand goes with, and you're not having to try and counter animate the IK hand or the gun to the chest. This makes it easier to block out, easier to get all of those subtleties into that gun. That's really good. So for example here, if I rotate the chest, you can see the gun follows along. If I rotate it up and down, gun follows along. That is good. The problem now is this shot has been animated, it's ready to start being refined and polished. Okay, we can polish up the body, polish up the core of the character, nice and easy. But when it comes to the gun, and trying to simplify the arcs and just clean up the arcs and get maybe a little overlap here and there, we are now going to have to fight that whole setup that we did. Any little change that happens into the chest is going to throw off everything we've done to the gun. So we're going to be constantly re-animating or re-correcting or counter-animating all of the gun over and over and over and over. That gets tedious very quick. Like for example, if I just do maybe a little adjustment here, well, the whole arc on the gun is gone. Have you shifted your stream timings? No, this is the same time. We did have daylight savings time in Canada and the US. So if you're not in a country that has daylight savings, it could be that the time is an hour offset. But at least in Canada, it's the same time. Cursed daylight savings. It's so confusing. The issue here is that we really just don't want to have to fight everything that's gone into creating this gun. We don't want to have to counter animate. The more we counter animate, the more the animation is going to be a pain to deal with, and we're never going to get exactly what we want. So, how do we do this? Well, basically what we're going to need to do is take the gun and then reapply it to a clean animation. Basically making it so that the gun is animatable on its own without any of the constraint data that was affecting it, but also while keeping everything that we had up to this point. We don't want to lose everything. We don't want to have to reanimate the gun from scratch. That defeats the whole purpose of the initial setup. So we really need to think through that. See, I checked with a friend in Axis and he said the full KDA video is hand animated. Nice. That's what I figured. It definitely has that element of hand animation. I'm so glad. Not that I have anything against motion capture, it's just so cool to see such talented animators doing these animations, and it just looks so good. It's so cool. So there's another question here before we jump into this. Any thoughts on the Agora community? Agora seems really cool. I haven't had a chance to check it out. For anyone who doesn't know, it's basically an online learning area. Basically, you can just go in and they have rigs and tutorials and all of that stuff. It's really cool. I haven't had a chance to dig into it too much, but I know some people who are kind of working in there and dealing with that kind of stuff, and they're really passionate and really pushing this, so I highly recommend checking it out. I don't know if it's open completely yet, but if you just Google Agora, you'll find it. And Tektricon is hello, how's it going? Nice to see you back. So let's jump in here and let me actually show an example of a situation that we've dealt with in the past on this and kind of what the goal is. So this is a shot that I had animated a while back on stream. Unfortunately, the VODs on this are not uploaded anymore. I'm going to try and re-upload them hopefully sometime soon if I get some time. That way you can see the whole process for this animation. But this is the animation we had. This is just an animation test I wanted to do for people on how to deal with a complex prop and kind of dealing with complex motion in a prop. And in this, we had animated the staff by hand, just kind of moving it around, and we reached the polishing phase where we wanted to get all the spacing really nice and interesting. The problem is the moment that you have a gun, that's the other shot, a staff or anything like that, doing these complex spins, you run into the very real possibility and the most likely possibility that you are going to get gimbal lock. And for anyone who doesn't know, gimbal lock is when your rotation axes in Maya no longer line up correctly and start to cause weird animation. This makes cleanup a nightmare, just a pain. So for example, let me take this staff and I'm going to turn off the constraint setup that I did, the polish constraint setup, just so we can see what it looked like before. So I'm just going to turn that off here. And hey, Animo, thanks so much for the sub. Oh man, thank you so much. I hope you're doing well. Oh, I really appreciate that. So, let me just mute this attribute here. So I'm just gonna turn off that constraint. And if we look at the staff, the beginning, oh, not too bad. Pretty much the same. Going through, it flips into the air. Okay. Same. Not too bad. As she catches it, watch what happens. Right through here, it's not so bad. And then as it comes to the top, it just stops spinning. Right here, it's gone from her hand. It's cut through between her legs. Now it's hitting her in the face, spinning the wrong way, and just a mess. It's horrible. Why is this happening? Because of gimbal lock. As it's spinning, the more it spins, the more it kind of goes out of control. All those axes no longer line up, which means that in order to get this to work correctly, we need to brute force it. And that's never fun. So this is the first pass I did on this shot was I just brute forced it, just to kind of show the process of that. So if you look at my graph editor here, for example, this is a section right as she catches it. It's keyed almost every single frame, just to get it somewhat okay. It's not even great, it's just okay. The spacing isn't quite right, there's issues with the arcs, and I'm having to key every single frame. And if you look at the curves, they don't really make sense. Like, why is this one wiggling? She's just spinning the staff, but the curve is bouncing. It doesn't make sense. Right here, why are these big bounces? And you can see the moment that I stopped keying every single frame is when suddenly this thing is just not making sense anymore. So we have the option. We can try to brute force it, animate it every single frame, key by key, frame by frame, to make sure that it's okay. Or we can set up a constraint system that can help us realign things. And that's what we're going to be doing today in a simplified form. In this case, by doing that, let me unmute this. By doing that, what I had created was a constraint setup that let me animate every axis separately, X, Y, and Z, for all the rotations. So for example, here, this large ring that I created controls just the Z rotation. This one controls just the X. And then we've got the Y elsewhere. So what this means is that we get nice clean animation. But if we look at our curves, because we've separated everything and created this setup, let's just look at our rotate Z. Look at that. Nice clean curve. If we compare the two, this is the contrast between them. We have one that is nice and smooth and makes sense. It's spinning in Z, so it's just like a helicopter blade or a fan. It's just going in one direction, so it just keeps going and going and going. compared to this one that's bouncing. That makes no sense. Why would the staff spin backwards? So creating that constraint setup allowed me to key this and polish it in a fraction of the time. I think it took me an hour to go key to key, or maybe an hour and a half, key to key, frame by frame, to get something halfway okay. And I had only done like a third of the spin, whereas this setup allowed me to polish the shot, not just refine it, polish it in about the same time, and the whole section. So it took a little bit of time to set up, but I was able to work much faster. So this is a complex version because we were dealing with a lot of spinning and things like that. But this kind of thing happens all the time, where you have an animation that there is something, whether it's the spinning that's causing the issue, or in the case of the other shot, there's a constraint setup that is creating this counter animation, these issues where we can't polish the shot quickly and efficiently. And it is a drag. It is a pain. We don't need to fight it. So that's what we're going to be covering today. How can we avoid fighting it? Now, there's a question here. Yeah, looking at the graphic, it just looks painful. Exactly. You might go through this, but got any tips to prevent gimbal lock? I'll go through that in just a little bit here. There's a few things you can do. So my Maya isn't allowing me to add keys on the curves using the I key. You might just want to reset your preferences. If that doesn't solve anything, double check your keyboard on your computer. So for example, I have multiple languages on my computer. Let's see, what's the hotkey again? So I sometimes will accidentally switch to a French keyboard on my computer, and then suddenly the hotkeys don't work. So if you have a different language, double check that it's set to the default English so that Maya knows the hotkeys properly. The other thing is that you have to hold down the I key and then middle mouse click. So if you're left clicking, it's not going to do anything. So for example here, hold down the I key, middle mouse click on the curve. So with that, let's actually go into the shot here that we had before. So this is Octavius's shot. And like I said, for anyone who hasn't or wasn't here earlier, the main issue that we're having is that in this shot, this character steps forward, he points the gun at the screen. And we really need to polish that gun, specifically the muzzle right there. The reason for this is that it is a hotspot. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, a hotspot in animation is a point that our eyes automatically want to look at. These can be anything with a point. So for example, the gun, it's basically like a finger pointing here. If you point a finger, the audience automatically wants to look at that. So regardless of where I'm pointing, the audience will want to put their eyes there. Their focus is going to come there. Same thing with an object. If I've got an object here and I'm moving it around, that becomes a hotspot. The same thing happens with a bright spot. So for example, in the background, that's a hotspot right there. It's a white, the sun's hitting there, is going to stand out. If I had a little badge that kind of stood out on my shirt here, that would be a hotspot. It's something that the audience will start to track with their eyes. So we need to be very careful how much we polish that. If we leave it alone, any little pops or wiggles will stand out. So we have to be very careful. In this case, we've got this, not only is it a hotspot, it's pointed right at the screen. It's super close to the screen, which means any little pops and wiggles or imperfections in the curve are gonna stand out like a sore thumb. We really need to polish this. This is gonna be a high level polish that needs to go into this gun. But this gun was also set up so that it follows the body. So if I rotate the body, the gun moves along. Polishing this thing is going to be a nightmare because any little thing you do to the body affects the gun. It's going to be a pain. It made it easy to block out because you could just animate the characters with their arms straight, locked out, and just spinning like this. Nice and easy. But now we need to polish. So let's jump into how we can do this. The goal, essentially, is going to be to save out the animation that is currently on that gun, and then give us new controls to reanimate it correctly. So let's do this. Now, the first thing I want to do, just for comparison's sake, and this is something I like to do just for myself as well when I'm doing this kind of stuff, is I do want to kind of keep the original version of the gun, just so I can compare, make sure I'm actually doing a good job and not making it worse. Let's see, in this case, should it be better, or would it be better if the gun was guiding? No, in this case, because the character has their arms locked out, if you had the gun leading the action, what you would end up with, let me go full screen here, is this disconnect where the gun could start doing this, and as the character is supposed to be still, the gun's just kind of waving and doing its own thing. The arms are constantly doing this as he's holding the gun, and you're always going to be watching the arms to try and make sure that they stay locked. So instead, by having the gun constrained to the chest, you can just have it there, move around, and then just animate it going up and down like so. So it makes blocking and keeping the consistency of the locked arms much easier. But polish becomes a pain. So we had two choices here. We could either make blocking a pain, which if blocking is a pain, it makes everything else kind of a pain later on. Or we could make blocking easy, but now polish is a pain. Luckily, we don't have to stick with either of those. We can make both of them easy and have a good life all around. So let's first track the original animation, just so we can compare what we had before and then what we're going to get afterwards. So to do this, I'm just going to create a locator. And sleep deprived. Thanks so much. 5 months already. Jeez. That's almost half a year already. How's it been that long? Every time someone subscribes, it's like, what the heck? How's it been so long? Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So we created a locator. Now, when you create locators, it's always a good thing to rename them. So I'm going to call this Old Anim Tracker. And then I always like to add LOC at the end for locator, just so I know when I'm looking up names and stuff. So we've got that locator, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to constrain it to the gun. So let's open up our outliner. We've got the chest buffer here. That's the thing that's controlling the gun, making sure we can keep it attached to the body. And here's the gun itself. So I'm going to take the gun, take the locator right there, constrain, parent, and I'm going to turn off maintain offset. What this does is it locks the locator to the gun and snaps it into place. So you can see the locator is now right there. But this is not the optimal position for this locator. We want to track the muzzle, not the grip of the gun. So now that we've created the constraint, it locked the locator into place and realigned it with the gun. So you can see the locator is actually lined up with the gun now. I'm going to delete that constraint, move the locator into place. It doesn't have to be perfect, but right there at the center of the gun. And then I'm going to reconstrain it. This is going to be something you'll see me do a lot in this demo. Create a constraint, delete the constraint, readjust, recreate the constraint. So constrain parent, and I'm going to this time turn maintain offset on. This will constrain the objects together, but leave the offset between them so that they don't snap. Now that locator is right at the end of the gun, right there. Done. Now, with that, it is attached to the gun, which is great, but I want to use this as a way of tracking my old animation so that regardless of any changes I add to the gun, this stays the same. If I change anything right now, so for example, if I take the body and adjust it, you can see the locator moves with. That's not what I want. This is to preserve the old animation. So once I have it constrained where I want it, I'm going to go to Edit, So I'm first going to select the locator, go to Edit, Keys, Bake Simulation. This is the other area we're going to be going through a lot in this demo. Now, what baking does is that it allows you to take constrained information, or information that is created, or let me put it this way. It takes animation that is created through a different process. So for example, a constraint. There are no keys on a constraint. The object is just following the gun. It is technically animated because it is moving, but there are no keys. It is just following along. You could almost say it's procedurally generated. It'll take animation that is created by a different means and convert it into keyframe animation. So the animation actually keyed, there's no constraints, there's no other math that goes in there. It's just keys. So with this locator selected, I'm going to go into my bake simulation options here, and I'm just going to reset the options and just use the default options here. We'll talk a little bit more about them. Basically, the important thing to keep in mind is the sample by. This is how many keys is it going to put. In this case, it's going to put a key on every single frame. So let's just hit bake here. And while that's baking, let me check here. Did I previously set up these constraints? No. So this is another person's shot. I had explained to them how to set up the constraint from the chest to the gun previously. And they did that setup on their own. Now I want to show how to get that set up and go into a polish setup. And why did you constrain it 2 times? So I constrained it twice. So the first constraint snaps the locator into place, so it lines everything up with the gun. And then the second constraint I did so that I could reposition the locator where I wanted. So the first one is to line it up, to snap it and just get everything in the correct position. And then the second constraint is my refined position. So we've got the locator here, and now you can see it's actually keyed. There's actually keys down here. Now, before I go too much further, I can just delete that constraint. I don't need it anymore. And you can see that locator right there follows the tip of the gun, but is not constrained. It is animated. There's our curves right there. Which means that any changes I do to the gun now won't affect that locator. It's still there. So this gives me a way of tracking my old position. Do I really need this? Not truly, but it allows me to make sure that if any changes happen and something goes horribly wrong, I can always find that old position, get it back into place. It's kind of just an extra backup in case I need it. So with that, let's actually just turn off the visibility here. So I'm going to delete the keys on the visibility and then turn it off. That way we have it there in case we need it, but we don't need to see it all the time. Let's see. If I have time in between, do you know if you can draw with a Wacom in Sync Sketch? Yes, you can. I do that all the time. If it's not working, try a different browser. It could be that the browser is causing an issue. Chrome or Firefox should work pretty well. I think Chrome is the recommended, I think. But either of those should work. If you already have one of those, try the other, just to see if it's the browser that's causing the issue. Okay, so we've tracked the gun. Great, we have the old setup. Now let's actually create the new constraint setup and start getting that into place. So to do this, we're once again going to use a locator. I'm going to go to Create, Locator. And what we're aiming for now is we want to take the gun animation and copy it onto a new control without any of the constraints that were affecting it before. That's the goal. So in order to do this, first we need a new control to work with. And we need to save out all of the animation onto that new control. So in this case, I'm going to be using a locator. Let's call this gun reanim locator. So this is going to be what I use to reanimate the locator. Okay. Now, it's right here at the origin of the world, down in the center. Not very useful there, and it's not even lined up with the gun. So let's line it up with the gun first. Same thing as before. select the gun, then the locator, constrain parent, and I'm going to turn maintain offset off. This will snap the locator right up to the gun, and now you can see it's all lined up right there. Nice. Okay, now I could jump right into the next steps and start reversing the constraint, get the gun attached to this locator. But there's something that is very crucial here, and that is I need to double check if my new setup is going to give me gimbal lock. So this is a question I was asked earlier, how to avoid gimbal lock. Well, there's a few different ways. The first is that you separate the rotations onto different controls. That's what I did with the staff animation here. So every control, this one ring here only controls the rotate Z, this one here only controls the rotate X, and there's another control that only controls the rotate Y. This makes it so that I have full control on each axis and they don't get gimbal lock because everything's separated. Very nice. You don't always need to do that. In this case, the other thing we can check is the rotation order. Rotation order is something we don't typically talk about in these streams just because it's kind of a more advanced thing, but it is something that you want to watch out for when you're looking for these issues. So that's a good question. What is gimbal lock? So gimbal lock is when two axes line up in Maya to the point where they act the same. So let me actually create a cone here so we can kind of examine that. So as you rotate objects, you're going to rotate them, and you'll notice that by default, your manipulator looks great. You're usually going to be in object or world mode, which means the manipulator lines up with the world axis down here or the object itself. So this is object mode. You can see how the manipulator moves with the object. If I set this to world mode, now it's just stuck to the world axis. But the problem with these is these are representations. These are just ways of lining up the axis to concepts, the world, an object. These are not the mathematical values. This is going a little bit into the math stuff of Maya, but if we look at the channel box here, these are the actual mathematical values that are happening when we rotate things. Now the problem here is that if I reset this, let's go here. Okay. If I rotate this in Y, oh look, the Y axis moves right there. Rotate in X, X moves. Rotate in Z, perfect, great. All that is working. But once you start rotating things more and more, let's do this. Rotate in Y, oh, interesting. I'm rotating the Y axis and everything's changing. Let's rotate in X, everything's changing. Z, okay, that's fine. But all the others, they're all changing all the time. Again, these axes here don't actually represent the true numerical value. They are just an easier way to rotate things in specific directions. To see the true rotations, you need to set this to gimbal mode. This is the true gimbal. So let's reset this again. So if I take this and rotate in X, you can see, okay, rotates in X. If I rotate in Z, rotates in Z. If I rotate in Y, it rotates in Y. This is the true gimbal. This is showing you the exact rotations. Now the problem happens is, and this is just how gimbals work. It's how the math works. Based on the rotation order of the gimbal, I'll talk about that in just a little bit, certain axes will affect each other differently. So for example, in this case, this is an XYZ order. So X, if I rotate this, nothing affects X. X just moves on its own. If I choose Y, you'll see that the Z axis, the blue one, doesn't move, but the Y is rotating and so is the X axis. If I move the Z, all three of them are rotating at the same time. This is how gimbals work. It's a hierarchy. Okay, what does that mean? Well, Basically, it means that if you take the middle axis, in this case the y, it's x, y, z. So if I take the y, I could rotate this to a point where the x and z line up. And suddenly, there's nothing that happens. If I rotate this in x, it's going that direction. If I rotate in z, it's going the same direction. They've lined up. This is gimbal lock. You've lost a direction, an entire axis of motion. And what's going to happen is, in order to calculate that, Maya is going to have to do these weird flips and wiggles, and it's going to be a pain. So, we have to be very careful of that. Now, if we look at our gun, before we do the constraint, normally when I'm doing something like this, the first thing I'm going to do is double check my rotation axes. So, if I set this back to default, so object mode here, and look at this, well, we've got this. Oh, perfect, great, it's gonna work wonderfully. Let's actually double check that. So if I switch this to gimbal mode, we can see that the y-axis lines up with the gun. So that's going to be the up and down axis. This is going to be one of the things that we use the most because the gun has to come up. You can see it do that, up, and then down. But if we control that axis, look what's happening. This is going to be the most rotation we deal with is that y-axis, and it's the one that's going to give us gimbal lock. It's the thing that's going to automatically lock the X and Z into place and make a huge pain to animate. It's just going to be a mess. I want that to be, if that's my main rotation, I don't want that to be the pain. I want that to be the easy axis, the one that doesn't affect anything else. So what I need to do is I need to think about what my rotation order is. Now, let's actually look at where you can change that. If you take the locator, you can go to the attribute editor, and it's right in here under the main object there. And right here is our rotate order. And as you can see, it's X, Y, Z. So again, the way you can keep this in mind is that the first letter is the least influenced by others. It does its own thing. So in this case, X, it does its own thing, doesn't affect anything else. That makes it very good for your main axis of movement. If you've got something that's going up and down like this, and there's a lot of different rotations in that axis, in that direction, that first letter is great for that because it's not going to affect any of the other axes. The y-axis, or sorry, the middle letter affects the one to the left. So y will affect X in this case. When it only affects one axis like that, it means it's going to cause gimbal lock. The middle letter here is the gimbal letter. It's the one we want the least influence on. That should be the one that does the least amount of work and kind of sits alone in the corner and just does a few little things. So the first letter should be the one you're using the most. Correct. It really depends, but usually it's going to be the one that happens the most. Now the last letter is going to affect everything. So in this case, for example, Z, it just changes the whole thing. So that is also a good one to use for something that rotates a lot. Honestly, it really depends on what your goal is, but usually the first letter is going to be the thing you want to have the big rotations on. The next big rotations that you have should be the last letter. The thing that rotates the least should be on the middle letter. So you want to kind of organize it like that. And NS Films, thank you so much for the sub and the reminder to drink. Geez, 9 months already? Wow, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So yeah, the middle letter is the problem child. Exactly. And Broken Tangent, hello. So if we look at this, let's look at our axis. Well, automatically we know that the y-axis is going to be probably the most important. It's the one that's going to line up with the gun here and move up and down. Okay. The x-axis is going to be our side to side in this case. Honestly, that's not too much there. It's not going to do a lot. It's just going to be on that side and then that's it. The z-axis is going to deal with where the gun points. That's actually going to be very important. We want that to line up with where the gun is going to be angling to. So, knowing that, well, we definitely want the y-axis to be first. That's the most important. And then the z-axis is probably going to be the second most important. So, let's set this to y, x, z. Most important, least, middle important. Okay. Now let's actually check that gimbal. Now, as I rotate this, you'll see that, oh, it doesn't affect anything else. If I rotate in Z here, so that's going to be the tilting. Great. That moves the whole thing. That's good. And then this, which is going to be probably some of the least in this animation, yeah, it can do its own thing. Yay! It's lined up. So, as a recap, I know I threw out a lot of information here and it's a lot of like complex stuff. But basically, before you set up a constraint thing that's going to make your animation life a lot easier, you want to make sure that you actually have the rotation order correct so that when you do constrain everything, you don't automatically run into gimbal lock. Alternatively, you can create multiple controls that each control one axis on its own. So like with the staff spin, which removes the possibility of gimbal lock, but it is a more complex setup. And in this case, we don't really need it. It just goes up and then down. It's more work than we need to worry about. So with that, let's realign the locator. When you switch the rotation order, and I can kind of show it here, it can realign the locator itself sometimes. And actually it's staying in place pretty well here. So YXZ, that's what we had. But sometimes it'll turn a little bit. So what I like to do is just delete the constraint, and just to double check, I'll redo the constraint. So select the gun, locator, constrain without offset. Oop, there we go. Just to re-snap it into place. Now, let's delete that locator. Or sorry, delete the constraint. Keep the locator. The locator is what we want here. And now, that locator has the correct rotation order, and it's almost ready to go. All we need to do now is put it into the spot that we want to pivot the gun from. So if I left it here, this is going to be our new control for the gun. I don't want the gun to pivot from the trigger area. It should pivot from the handle, specifically the pivot point of the gun, which I've never held a gun, so I don't know what the weight is. I would assume it's probably somewhere like right around there. It could be lower, could be higher. This is where actually holding the prop can help a lot. So for example, if you're dealing with a sword, you want to figure out where the pivot point should be. It'll just make the animation a little easier to polish and get that really fine, nice motion in there. So I'm just going to find where I assume the pivot point's going to be. Probably right around there. You can refine it to whatever you want. Now, let's reconnect it to the gun. So select the gun and the locator, but this time constrain it with maintain offset on. Okay. Why did we reconnect it to the gun? It's supposed to be controlling the gun, but we've got it being led by the gun. The reason we have it here is that we need to save the animation from the gun. The gun is constrained and has all its own animation. And we want to transfer that animation onto the constraint, onto the locator, so that the locator now has those keys. And we do that by constraining the locator to the gun, so it follows along. And then with the locator selected, going to Edit, Keys, Bake Simulation. We're going to take all of that motion that was created there by the constraint and turn it into keys. Now, once again, we go in here. The thing I'm going to turn on here is Smart Bake. So what Smart Bake does is instead of setting key every single frame or every 2 frames, every 3 frames, it's going to go in and just set a key where it thinks it needs. It's going to try to do it smartly. That way we don't have a ton of keys to work with and hopefully get something that still follows along pretty much exactly, but with a lot less work to deal with. So let's bake that. So let's see. Is it common to change the rotation order of a constraint halfway through animating? I wouldn't say it's common, no. It's sometimes you do have to do it, but I try to avoid changing a rotation order midway if I can help it. Sometimes though, you just have to do it or else the gimbal lock just becomes a nightmare. But I do try to avoid it if possible. And then there was another thing here. Yeah, Sin mentioned if you have Animbot, you can change the rotation order for all your keys, keeping the animation intact. That is really a really good tool. I forget where it is exactly. Xform. One of these buttons. It is an amazing tool. If you have Animbot, or if you don't have Animbot, I highly recommend it. It's just a really good tool to have. The last pink one. Okay. That one here. Oh yeah, there you go. Selection attributes space switcher. So yeah, that is hugely helpful because then you don't have to worry about getting it wrong the first time. Now, if you don't have Animbot, you can do it the way I did here, which is just switching it and then reconstraining it. And then you can transfer all that over. It's a little bit more of a pain, but if you don't have the plugin, you can do it manually. Okay, so our baking has finished. We can smell the fresh bread coming out of the oven. Oh, it's great. Well, what that means is now that the baking is complete, this locator is no longer constrained. We can still see the constraint there. Let's actually delete it because we don't need it. But it still follows the gun. It is animated. We copied the animation from the gun onto the locator. Great. With that, what we need to do is take the gun and place it back onto the locator. Constrain it to the locator so the locator is now our driving force. So, to do this, let's take our gun and what we need to do is disconnect it from all of its previous constraints and hierarchy. That way there's nothing else influencing the gun from before. We don't want to have to counter animate against something else. So in this case, I'm just going to go to frame 1. You can just go to any key that, or any frame that has a key. And I'm going to first take the gun and set a key on it. This just makes sure that even though it's constrained, I'm saving this position in place. Next, I'm going to delete the constraint from the gun. And then just to double check, I'm going to delete the animation from the scales because I think there was an animation on there. Usually you don't have to do this, but in this case, it's just going to make it easier. And I'm going to unparent it from the chest buffer control here. And let's, oops. Yeah, there we go. So why did I do that? Well, I deleted the constraint, so any constraint information on the gun no longer affects it. And I unparented it so that all the animation from this control no longer affects it. At this point, the gun is just on its own. It's doing it nothing really. If I was to scrub through, you can see it just drops out of screen. It's not following anything anymore. That means I can reconstrain it now. So I'm going to take my gun reanimation locator, which has all of the animation that it had before. So I saved all the animation onto there. I'm going to constrain the gun to it. So locator, then gun, constrain, parent, and I'm going to make sure maintain offset is turned on. Oop, right there. Now, if we go through this, well, look at that. The gun is animated, doing exactly what it did before. Great. Except it's on its own control here. There's no constraints. There's no information that is affecting this gun, which means that if I have to adjust the body, let's actually rotate that. Oh, look at that. The gun doesn't get affected anymore. Not only that, but because it's on just its own control, if I look into the graph editor here, my rotate Y curve. So if I need to start polishing things, let's actually look at a spot right here, scrub through. Okay, the gun comes up and, oh, you know, maybe I want to add a little overshoot right there where the gun comes up, and instead of just going straight back down here, we get just a little bit more of an arc. Well, before we would have had to deal with the constraint and the body and everything else, all these multiple controls just to get that arc to be okay. Or I go in here, take my rotate or my translate Y curve, my up and down, and let's just add a little bit of a overshoot right here. Boop. Clean up that arc. Now it goes up and we get a little bit more of a hold. Oh, maybe I want to hold it a little bit more. Maybe offset this from the body. So the body comes up and then down, and then the gun follows that afterwards. Let's take that and offset it. There we go. A little offset. We have full control over this now. We can do whatever we want. Now, ideally, I'm not going to be making huge changes to this. I don't want to reanimate it completely, but I have the ability to polish this without worrying about anything else. So let's kind of pick some spots here. So maybe as he kind of pulls up the gun, we want to add a little bit more of an arc to there. So we can have two things. We could have the gun kind of come out and then he does this where it arcs out like so. Or maybe he kind of comes in, keeps it close to the body, and then sticks it out. Well, that's going to be our translate Z in this case. So our forward back motion right there. So if I want to adjust that arc here, I can just come in and maybe I want to keep it a little closer to the body right here at the beginning. Well, just pull that in right there. Let's kind of keep that a little tucked in. He comes out. Maybe I want to overshoot it. His arm goes out and then comes in to get that nice little extra weight into the gun. Let's over straighten it there. Maybe push that arc, get that nice ease in, and then a nice settle. So now goes out and settles. There we go. Done. I didn't have to fight any constraints. I didn't have to fight counter animation. It's just there. And at this point, I can just keep polishing. What if, for example, I want to add a little bit more drag to the gun? Have the tip drop down a little bit more. Rotate Y. That's going to be our rotation here. Well, let's add some drag. Instead of having it right here, let's drag it up like that. Now it drags, and we get a little bit more of a flick to the end. And maybe we want to overshoot that. Oop. Nice little overshoot. Maybe that's a little too much. Well, I have full control. Okay. So I can start polishing this up however I want now. So, how else can we use this? Well, because all of these keys are now on their own and we're not dealing with any other objects, what happens if I want to make the animation a little bit more still? So that as he's pointing the gun, it's not doing this across the screen, but just kind of stays a little bit more centered. Well, I can do that. So let's say I want this moment here to be a little bit more, or let's say this moment, because it's moving a lot right here. I want that gun to be a little bit more constrained and held tight in place. So I'm just going to go in here. Let's take my translate X, in this case, this is going to be the side of the gun, and try to tone this down. Now, there's a lot of keys here. It's going to be a pain to deal with. Just try and tone this down nicely. Well, there's plugins and things you can use for that, or I can just take all of these keys, this whole range here. I'm going to turn on the lattice deform tool in the graph editor right here. And what this will allow me to do is just take these points and scale them down. And you can see it doesn't destroy the animation. It's just kind of morphing it. So now I can scale this down, make it much, much smaller. Maybe kind of ease that in there. And now that gun is much more still right here. Maybe I want to do the same thing with my Translate Z. Kind of keep it a little bit more locked in place right here. So it comes out, settles back in. Let's not have it go quite so far back right here. So I'm going to take this whole range and just start bringing that up. Like so, maybe something like that. Now that gun is more still. And we can kind of compare this with our old locator. So you can see where the gun used to be and how much it used to move from that top view compared to what it is now. Much more still. So now we've got that gun pointed at the screen and it's not doing this all over the place. We can keep it more focused. It still has all of the animation that it had from the body, so it still feels connected, but it's simplified. And we can just keep going with this. There's really no stopping us. We can just, let's say go at the end here. He drops the gun. Well, what if I want to push the arc here? Maybe add a little drag to the end of the gun. Right now, if we watch just the tip of the gun, it comes down and it kind of snaps down. Pop. Well, let's ease that a little bit. So maybe we'll come in here. This is my Translate Y. Oops. And we'll just push our curve a little bit so it has a little bit more hang time up here. Just a little. Okay. It goes through. We get that nice little hang time before it drops down. Okay, we're getting a little bit of a pull back right there. Maybe as he goes up, instead of just snapping right back, what if we get a little anticipation there where he's got his gun out and he goes like that. So you get that little motion forward just a little bit. Well, because it's all separated, we can just go boop, like that. Now, as he goes up, we get a little forward motion. Okay. And let's actually delay that a little bit. Or, yeah, let's delay that. So offset that. So now the gun actually goes up first, then pulls back down. Let's also just tweak our spacing. So we get a little bit more of an ease here, and then zooms in right through there. There we go. You can see how that suddenly feels just a little bit cleaner there. Well, what if we also want the gun to lead? So as he goes down, we have the gun, the tip of the gun kind of drop, almost like he's letting the weight of the gun take over. Well, let's do that. As he comes up, let's actually take our rotate Y, offset that one frame, like that, and then just ease that in right there. So something like this. Now, we get that. Done. Polished. Easy. No fighting constraints. If I have to change something on the body and the shoulder, it's not going to affect anything on this gun. But I can have full control. So that's the goal of this. It's to preserve the animation that you had, especially if you had animation that would influence the other object, but make it easy for you to polish that animation so that you are not having to fight and counter animate things. So that's pretty much it. At this point, it's just a matter of cleaning up and kind of doing what you want. And to kind of compare here, if we kind of watch the old kind of pistol tip right there, the muzzle, you can see where it used to be, how it used to go backwards right here, right there, and now the DK wrap. So now you have this offset there. There we go. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully that made sense. I know it's a lot of different concepts to keep in mind. Honestly, it's not super complicated. It looks complicated, but once you get the hang of it, this is something you can do very quickly on many shots. Essentially what you're doing is you're taking a locator, typically, copying the animation from the original object onto that locator, and then reversing the constraint so that the object then follows the locator. That's it. And the big tools here are going to be constraining and baking. So hopefully that makes sense. If anyone has questions on that, definitely let me know, because I know it's kind of a complex thing to wrap your brain around. It's one of those things that when you do it, that's when things will really kind of click. When you kind of just watch it, it can kind of seem complicated. I remember for me when I first learned this and I watched people do this, it's like I don't get it, why? And then I tried and it's so nice. I have a question about the curves. Which mode do you prefer to work in, weighted or non-weighted? I always work in weighted, or most of the time I work in weighted tangents. It's just kind of what I'm used to, so you'll notice that by default I can just move these around like that. I try not to use the weighted that much if I can avoid it. So even though I'm working in weighted, just in case, I kind of treat it as if it's non-weighted. This is so that I make sure I put more keys in than relying on the tangents themselves. It's very easy when you're working in weighted tangents to go, okay, I need, for example, let's go here. I need to have this exact curve right there. So I'm going to scale up all of these to get this exact curve that I need. The problem is that when you're using the tangents like that, nothing's saved. So if I accidentally somehow hit the auto tangent button or any other tangent type, I've lost everything that I did. And this is something I learned when I was a student. I'd polished an entire animation using weighted tangents, and I cleaned up all the keys. It was just weighted tangents, beautiful curves all around. And I guess, I don't know how I did it. I must have accidentally hit auto tangents or splines, saved the scene, closed my file, and the next day when I opened it up, all my tangents were reset. All the polish that I did was gone. So what I prefer to do is, if I do use weighted tangents, so I do shape the curves like that, use the insert key tool to add the keys in afterwards and save that. Because now, if something goes wrong and I hit auto tangents, well, the curve's not that different. Quick little fix here and there, but overall my animation is preserved. So that's my preference. I like to have weighted tangents on because it gives me the flexibility to kind of shape the curves how I want, but then I will set keys so that I don't rely on the weighted tangents. Let's see, what was the setup before and why was that hard to polish? So the setup before here was that the gun was constrained to the chest so that the character could move around and the gun would follow. And because his arms are locked, it made it very easy to block the shot. So the character doesn't have all of the arms doing this the whole time. You can just pull up the gun, stay like this, bring it back down. It keeps everything in line. The problem is, because it's constrained to the chest, you're then suddenly having to counter animate anything. So if you move the chest a little bit, if I move the chest here, you have to move the gun back, and move the chest here, move the gun back. Any curves or any like little offsets that you do to clean up the arcs, it's going to be a nightmare to polish. So by unconstraining it and transferring it onto a new control that just moves on its own, you still have all of that connection in place, but now you're able to refine the animation on its own without anything affecting it. The insert key tool is the I key, so I as an insert, and middle mouse click. S is set a key. So insert key just does that. Now for anyone who's curious, the difference between setting a key and inserting a key is just the way Maya handles the tangents. So for example, let's have this extreme curve here. When you set a key, so let's set a key over here. What setting a key does is it just inserts a key, and the tangents on either side, on either key, on the other, so let's put it this way. I set a key here. The tangents on the keys on either side of this key stay the same. They aren't affected by Maya, which in most cases isn't a problem. But the moment that you start adjusting keys yourself, so let's say here, I adjust this tangent, I'm going to make it like so and like so. If I set a key in between these now, just hit S to set a key, boop, look what happens. We get this weird wiggle. This is because Maya is going, okay, I'm going to put a key here, and I'm not affecting anything else. You made sure to put the tangents where you wanted, so I'm not going to touch that. I'm going to do a good job and just put a key, nothing else. Which is okay for most cases, but especially when you get into polish and you're starting to refine all of your tangents, you start getting things like this, which is a pain. So the insert key tool comes in when you're starting to do that polish. When you're starting to go in and refine all of your tangents, if I use the insert key tool, which is the I key, and then middle mouse click, or you can click on this button right here, middle mouse click, it'll insert the key and readjust the tangents on either side to keep the curve exactly the way it was. So now we get these adjusted tangents right here. That's the main difference. One adjusts tangents, one doesn't. If you're just blocking out a shot and you're not into the graph editor yet, hitting S to set a key is all you need. Once you start going into the graph editor and tweaking things, insert key kind of starts to dominate a little bit more. Hopefully that makes sense.